The late October morning brought crisp mountain air through the open windows of the East Tennessee Historical Archives in Johnson City. Dr. Rebecca Thorne had worked at the archives for 12 years, and she still found quiet satisfaction in the smell of old paper and preservation chemicals, the tangible connection to the past that permeated every corner of the building. She was 41 years old, methodical in her approach to historical research, known among her colleagues for her attention to detail and her refusal to dismiss anomalies as simple errors or coincidences. The collection she was processing had arrived 6 months earlier, donated by the estate of Eleanor Whitman, a descendant of one of the prominent families that had settled in the Watauga River Valley in the mid-1800s. The Whitman family had been instrumental in the region's early coal mining industry, and their papers included business records, personal correspondence, land deeds, and dozens of family photographs spanning 7 decades. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive collection that could provide invaluable insight into Appalachian social and economic history during the period of rapid industrialization. Rebecca had been working through the photographs systematically, cataloging each image, noting dates when available, identifying individuals when possible, and creating high-resolution digital scans for preservation and research purposes. The photographs ranged from formal studio portraits to casual snapshots, from the 1870s through the 1940s, documenting multiple generations of Whitman family life. Many of the images had detailed annotations on the back, Eleanor's careful handwriting identifying people and places, providing context that made the collection particularly valuable. The photograph that would change everything was in a leather portfolio near the bottom of the third archival box. It was larger than most of the others, approximately 8 by 10 inches, mounted on heavy cardboard backing. The image showed the Whitman family gathered on the front porch of their home in the mining community of Laurel Creek in 1903. The house was substantial, a 2-story frame structure that spoke to the family's relative prosperity. 7 people were arranged in a careful composition that suggested professional photography. At the center stood Benjamin Whitman, the family patriarch, his hand resting on an ornate walking stick. He was in his early 50s, his face weathered but dignified, wearing a dark suit that showed the formality of the occasion. Beside him sat his wife, Catherine, in a high-necked dress with elaborate lace collar, her expression serious but not severe. Their 5 children ranged in age from approximately 8 to 22, arranged in descending order of height, the older ones standing, the younger seated on the porch steps. Rebecca had scanned dozens of similar family portraits already, and this one seemed unremarkable at first glance. But she had learned long ago that first glances often missed important details. She positioned the photograph under her high-resolution scanner, adjusting the settings to capture maximum detail from the century-old image. The scanning process took several minutes, the machine's light bar moving slowly across the photograph's surface, converting reflected light into digital data. When the scan was complete, Rebecca opened it on her large monitor, using specialized software to examine the image at high magnification. This was standard practice, allowing her to identify damage that needed documentation, to read faded writing, to see details that weren't visible to the naked eye. She started at the top left corner and worked systematically across the image, noting the texture of the wooden siding, the condition of the porch railings, the clarity of each person's features. She was halfway through the examination when she noticed something odd. Behind the family group, the front door of the house stood partially open. Through the gap, the interior was visible but indistinct, lost in shadow. But as Rebecca increased the magnification and adjusted the brightness and contrast, something emerged from that darkness. A face. Or rather, the reflection of a face in what must have been a mirror hanging inside the entrance hall, positioned at an angle that caught light from the open door. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. She zoomed in further, enhancing the reflected image as much as the technology would allow without introducing distortion. The face was that of a young person, possibly a teenager, with delicate features and dark hair. The angle and distance made it impossible to determine gender with certainty, but the face was clearly distinct from any of the 7 people posed on the porch. This was someone else. Someone inside the house while the photograph was being taken, someone whose presence had been captured accidentally through the reflection. She sat back, thinking through the possibilities. Perhaps a servant who had been asked to step inside during the formal family portrait. That would make sense given the Whitman family's social standing. Or possibly a neighbor who had stopped by and politely retreated when they saw the photography session in progress. There were numerous mundane explanations that would account for the reflected face. But something about the situation nagged at Rebecca. She pulled up the photograph's backing, which she had also scanned for archival purposes. Eleanor Whitman's annotation read, "Whitman family, Laurel Creek, October 1903. Father Benjamin, Mother Catherine, children, Thomas, 22, Elizabeth, 19, James, 16, Sarah, 13, Robert, 8. Photographer, J. Harrison Wells of Bristol. 7 people, all identified. No mention of anyone else present." Rebecca opened her research database and cross-referenced the names with census records, birth certificates, and other documents in the Whitman collection. The family structure matched exactly. Benjamin and Catherine Whitman had 5 children, born between 1881 and 1895. There was no record of a 6th child, no indication of household staff living with the family in 1903, nothing that would explain the additional presence in the photograph. Her colleague, Daniel Martinez, passed by her workstation carrying a box of documents to the climate-controlled storage vault. He was 35, had been with the archives for 5 years, and had become Rebecca's primary collaborator on complex research projects. They worked well together, Rebecca's methodical approach complementing Daniel's intuitive leaps and creative problem-solving. "You have that look," Daniel said, pausing. "The one that means you've found something interesting." Rebecca gestured him over and showed him the original photograph, then the enhanced digital scan with the reflected face clearly visible. Daniel leaned in, his eyes widening as he absorbed what he was seeing. "That's definitely a person," he said slowly. "Young, maybe mid-teens? Not one of the children on the porch. Look at the facial structure, completely different from any of them." "And Eleanor's annotation lists only the 7 people we can see directly," Rebecca added. "No mention of anyone else." They spent the next hour examining the photograph from every possible angle, using different image enhancement techniques, comparing the reflected face to the documented family members at various ages, looking for any detail that might provide identification. The face remained stubbornly mysterious, clearly present but impossible to identify with certainty. "We need to go through the entire Whitman collection again," Daniel said finally. "Every letter, every document, every other photograph. If this person was significant enough to be in the house during a formal family portrait, there has to be some other reference to them somewhere in the papers." Rebecca agreed. They pulled the remaining boxes from the Whitman collection and began a systematic review, this time looking specifically for anything that might explain the mysterious reflected presence. It was tedious work, requiring careful attention to every detail, but both of them had learned that historical research was often about patience and persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. 3 days into their renewed examination of the collection, Daniel found the first clue. It was in a personal letter from Catherine Whitman to her sister, dated April 1903, 6 months before the photograph was taken. The letter discussed ordinary domestic matters, children's health, household management, local gossip. But one paragraph stood out. "We continue to manage the situation as best we can," Catherine had written in her flowing script. "Benjamin believes it is for the best, and I must defer to his judgment in this matter. The children have adapted well, though I see the questions in their eyes. I trust that time will prove the wisdom of our choice, difficult though it has been." The passage was frustratingly vague, providing no specific information about what situation was being managed or what choice had been made. But it suggested family complexity that wasn't visible in the official records, something that required management and adaptation, something about which Catherine had reservations even as she supported her husband's decision. Rebecca documented the letter carefully and continued searching. Over the next week, she found several other similarly oblique references in Catherine's correspondence. A letter from December 1902 mentioned the new arrangement and expressed hope that he will find contentment in his altered circumstances. A letter from July 1903 noted that the boy seems well and that Benjamin visits regularly, though he maintains the discretion we agreed upon. The pronouns were revealing. He and the boy suggested a male child or young person, consistent with the ambiguous gender of the reflected face. The references to visits and discretion implied someone who lived separately from the main household but maintained family connection. The pattern was becoming clearer, even as the specific details remained elusive. Daniel approached the mystery from a different angle, researching the photographer, J. Harrison Wells. Wells had been a successful commercial photographer based in Bristol, Tennessee, with a studio that served the growing middle and upper-class populations in the Tennessee-Virginia border region. His work was technically sophisticated, and he was known for his careful composition and attention to detail. In the archives of the Bristol Historical Society, Daniel found Wells' business ledgers, meticulously maintained records of every commission, including client names, dates, prices, and brief notes about the photographic sessions. The entry for October 1903 confirmed the Whitman family sitting at their Laurel Creek home. But Wells had added a note that caught Daniel's attention: 7 subjects arranged as requested. Client specified particular framing to include doorway. Extended session to achieve desired natural lighting through entrance. "Rebecca, look at this," Daniel said, showing her the ledger entry he'd photographed. The client, that would be Benjamin Whitman, specifically requested framing that included the doorway. That's unusual. Most formal family portraits focused tightly on the people, minimizing background elements. But Whitman wanted the open door in the frame. Rebecca studied the note, her mind working through the implications. "Intentional," she said slowly. "He wanted that reflection captured. Or at least, he knew it would be there and chose not to prevent it. The question is why? Why create a formal family portrait that deliberately includes a hidden 8th person?" They returned to the collection with renewed focus, now looking specifically for information about any child associated with the Whitman family who wasn't living in the household in 1903. Rebecca expanded her search to include institutional records, school enrollment documents, church records, anything that might reveal a child connected to the family but separate from it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the back of the 5th archival box, underneath stacks of business correspondence, Rebecca found a small leather journal. It was Benjamin Whitman's personal diary, covering the years 1900 to 1905. Unlike the business records and family letters, this was intimate, unguarded, Benjamin's private thoughts recorded in his own hand. Rebecca opened it carefully, the leather binding cracking slightly with age. She turned to the entries from 1903, reading through Benjamin's daily notations. Most were brief, recording weather, business transactions, social visits. But in early January 1903, the entries became longer, more reflective, revealing a man struggling with a difficult decision. "Catherine and I have agreed," Benjamin wrote on January 12, 1903. "David cannot remain in the household. His condition has become too apparent, and the questions from neighbors and business associates too frequent. Dr. Morrison believes the county home in Jonesboro would provide appropriate care, but I cannot bear the thought of him in such a place, surrounded by strangers and institutional coldness. I have therefore made alternative arrangements with the Reverend and Mrs. Fletcher in Laurel Fork. They are good people, childless, and willing to provide him with a proper home. He will be cared for as family, though he cannot bear our name publicly." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she read the entry. David. The mysterious reflected presence had a name. She read on, Benjamin's subsequent entries chronicling visits to the Fletcher household, describing David's adjustment to his new living situation, expressing both relief that a solution had been found and guilt over the necessity of separation. "He is my son in all but law," Benjamin wrote in March 1903. "Catherine and I took him in when he was but days old, his mother having died in childbirth and no other family willing to claim him. We raised him as our own, loved him without reservation. But as he grew, it became clear that his parentage would forever mark him in this community. I am a man of business and reputation. My legitimate children's prospects depend on maintaining our social standing. And yet, when I visit David in his new home, when I see his face light up at my arrival, I question everything. Is reputation worth more than a child's happiness? Is social standing more valuable than family love? The entries painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and historically common. David was almost certainly Benjamin's biological son from a relationship before or outside his marriage to Catherine, or possibly an illegitimate child of a family member whom Benjamin had taken responsibility for. In early 20th century Appalachian society, such situations were managed through quiet arrangements, children placed with willing families, connections maintained privately while public acknowledgement was withheld. Catherine's letters now made complete sense. The situation being managed was David's presence and then his removal from the household. The choice was the decision to place him with the Fletchers. The boy who seemed well and whom Benjamin visits regularly was David, living separately but not forgotten. And the photograph, with its carefully composed inclusion of the open doorway and the reflected face captured in the mirror, was Benjamin's way of including David in the family portrait while respecting the social constraints that required his public absence. It was a secret inclusion, visible only to those who looked carefully, who examined the image closely enough to see past the obvious 7 people to the hidden 8th. Rebecca felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with uncovering tragic historical truths. She had solved the mystery of the reflection, but the solution revealed a story of love constrained by social expectations, of a child separated from his family by circumstances of birth and community judgment. "We need to find out what happened to him," Daniel said quietly. He had been reading over Rebecca's shoulder, following Benjamin's diary entries. To David, did he survive to adulthood? Did he ever reconnect with the family? There has to be more to the story. Rebecca nodded, already planning the next phase of research. They had identified the mysterious reflected presence, but David's story was far from complete. And somewhere, there might be descendants who had no idea about this hidden branch of their family tree, a connection erased from official records but preserved accidentally in a photograph's reflection. The search for David's story required Rebecca and Daniel to expand their research far beyond the Whitman family papers. They started with the Reverend Fletcher mentioned in Benjamin's diary, searching church records and census data for Laurel Fork, a small community about 15 miles from Laurel Creek in the mountainous regions of northeastern Tennessee. The 1900 census showed Reverend Thomas Fletcher, age 38, and his wife Mary, age 35, living in Laurel Fork with no children. Fletcher served as pastor of the small Presbyterian church that served the scattered mountain communities in that area. By the 1910 census, the Fletcher household included a 16-year-old boy listed as David Fletcher, nephew, with a birth year of approximately 1894. "That has to be him," Daniel said, pointing to the census entry on the screen. The age matches, and being listed as a nephew was a common way to explain the presence of a child who wasn't actually related by blood. Respectable families did this all the time when they took in illegitimate children or orphans, giving them a plausible family connection without acknowledging the full truth. Rebecca documented the census finding and began searching for other records that might mention David Fletcher. She found his name in school enrollment records for the Laurel Fork district, showing regular attendance through 1908, when he would have been about 14. After that, the documentary trail became thinner, harder to follow. Property records revealed that Thomas Fletcher died in 1911, leaving his small farm to his wife Mary. Tax records showed that Mary continued to operate the farm with assistance until her own death in 1924. But there was no clear indication of what happened to David during those years, whether he remained on the farm or moved elsewhere as he reached adulthood. Daniel took a different approach, searching newspaper archives for mentions of David Fletcher in the region. The Bristol Herald-Courier, the Johnson City Chronicle, and other regional papers had been digitized and were searchable, though optical character recognition errors sometimes made the searching imperfect and frustrating. He found the first significant mention in an August 1912 edition of the Bristol paper, a brief social note buried in the local news section. David Fletcher of Laurel Fork has accepted a position with the Clinchfield Railroad Company, working on the construction crews building the new line through the mountains. Young Fletcher, who has shown considerable aptitude for mechanical work, will be stationed at the company camp near Spruce Pine, North Carolina. Railroad construction, Daniel said, showing Rebecca the article. That was hard, dangerous work, but it paid relatively well and offered opportunities for young men without family connections or extensive education. The Clinchfield Line was a major engineering project, cutting through some of the most difficult mountain terrain in the region. Rebecca nodded, adding the information to her growing file on David. The railroad connection was interesting, potentially providing a clearer documentary trail through employment records. She contacted the archives of the Clinchfield Railroad Historical Society, explaining her research and requesting any employment records or photographs that might include David Fletcher. While they waited for responses to various archival inquiries, Rebecca returned to Benjamin Whitman's diary, reading through entries from 1904 and 1905. Benjamin continued to visit David regularly, his entries showing genuine affection and ongoing concern for the boy's welfare. In one particularly revealing passage from April 1904, Benjamin reflected on the complexity of his situation. "David grows stronger and more capable each year," he wrote. "He helps Reverend Fletcher with farm work and shows a natural mechanical aptitude that my own sons lack. Yesterday he repaired the church bell mechanism, a task that had baffled the local blacksmith. I felt such pride in his accomplishment, yet I could not openly acknowledge it, could not introduce him to business associates as my son. Thomas, my eldest, will inherit the mining interests and the family reputation. Elizabeth will make a good marriage that will strengthen our social position. But David, who has my stubborn determination and my mother's quick mind, will have to make his own way without benefit of the Whitman name. The injustice of it haunts me." The diary entries stopped abruptly in November 1905. Rebecca checked death records and found that Benjamin Whitman had died suddenly in December 1905, at age 57, likely from a heart attack based on the brief death notice in the local paper. His obituary listed his surviving widow and 5 children, making no mention of David. What happened to their relationship after Benjamin died? Daniel wondered aloud. Did Catherine continue the connection? Did David maintain contact with his half-siblings? Catherine Whitman's letters provided partial answers. In a letter to her sister dated March 1906, 3 months after Benjamin's death, Catherine wrote, "I have honored Benjamin's wishes regarding young David. I visit when I can, though the journey to Laurel Fork grows more difficult for me. The boy grieved deeply for Benjamin, and I believe he understood more about their true relationship than we realized. He asked me directly whether Benjamin was his father, and I could not bring myself to lie to him. He deserved that truth at least." A subsequent letter from 1908 indicated ongoing contact. "David has shown himself to be a responsible and capable young man. Reverend Fletcher speaks highly of his character and work ethic. I have established a small trust fund to provide for his education or to help him establish himself in trade. Benjamin would have wanted him to have opportunities, even if he cannot claim the family name." The trust fund was significant, suggesting that David's connection to the Whitman family, while never public, was substantial and acknowledged within the family. Rebecca searched probate records for Catherine's estate, finding that when she died in 1920, her will included a bequest to David Fletcher of Laurel Fork, Tennessee, in recognition of his connection to this family and my late husband's affection for him. The bequest was modest but not insignificant, enough to purchase property or start a small business. The Clinchfield Railroad Historical Society responded to Rebecca's inquiry with copies of employment records and crew photographs from the Spruce Pine construction camp. David Fletcher appeared in several group photos from 1912 and 1913, a lean young man with dark hair and intense eyes, usually positioned among the mechanical crew responsible for maintaining drilling equipment and locomotives. One photograph was particularly striking. It showed David standing beside a massive steam drill, his hand resting on the machinery with obvious familiarity and pride. Someone had written on the back, "David Fletcher, best mechanic on the Clinchfield Line, June 1913. The photograph revealed a young man who had found his place in the world, who had developed skills and earned respect through competence and hard work. But the railroad records also contained a darker note. In November 1913, there was an accident report documenting a tunnel collapse that killed 3 workers and seriously injured 7 others. David Fletcher was listed among the injured, suffering from a crushed leg and internal injuries. He spent 6 weeks in the company hospital before being released with permanent physical limitations that ended his career with the railroad. That must have been devastating, Daniel said, studying the accident report. He'd found work he was good at, earned respect, built a life independent of the family complications. And then one accident takes it all away. Rebecca tracked David through the 1920 census, finding him back in Laurel Fork, living on the former Fletcher farm with Mary Fletcher, now listed as David Fletcher, farmer, with notation of physical disability. The census taker had added a note. Informant walks with pronounced limp, left leg injury. What happened over the next decade was harder to trace. Property records showed that David purchased the Fletcher farm from Mary's estate in 1924, following her death. Tax records indicated he managed to keep the property despite the economic difficulties that affected the region. But there were no marriage records, no children listed in subsequent censuses, suggesting David lived alone or with unrecorded household members. The trail seemed to go cold in the early 1930s. But then Daniel found an unexpected connection while researching the broader history of Laurel Fork. A WPA oral history project conducted in 1938 had interviewed elderly residents of mountain communities, documenting their memories of early 20th century life. One interview was with a woman named Agnes Miller, who had lived in Laurel Fork her entire life. "We had a man named David Fletcher who was real good with mechanical things," Agnes had told the WPA interviewer. "Fixed clocks, radios, farm equipment, anything with moving parts. Folks would bring him things from all over the county. He didn't talk much about himself, kept pretty private, but he was always fair in his prices and honest in his work. Some said he had connections to the Whitman family over in Laurel Creek, though nobody spoke of it openly. There were rumors, you know how people talk, but David never confirmed or denied anything. He just did his work and lived his life quiet-like." The interviewer had asked about David's family, and Agnes had provided an interesting detail. He had a young woman living with him for a time in the mid-20s. Folks thought maybe they'd marry, but she left after a few years. Don't know where she went. After that, David lived alone. "I remember seeing him at church sometimes, always sat in the back, left before anyone could talk to him much. I think he was lonely, truth be told, but he'd built walls around himself that nobody could quite get through." Rebecca felt a deep sadness reading this account. David had survived his childhood displacement, his railroad injury, the economic hardships of the Depression, but he had done so isolated, unable to fully connect with the community or build the kind of family relationships that might have sustained him. The circumstances of his birth and childhood had marked him in ways that persisted throughout his life. But the WPA interview contained one more crucial piece of information. Agnes mentioned that David had a younger friend named Robert Whitman who would visit occasionally in the 1930s. "That was one of Benjamin Whitman's boys," Agnes said. "The youngest one. He'd make the trip from Laurel Creek to visit David, bring him supplies sometimes. I always thought that was decent of him, maintaining some kind of connection." Rebecca cross-referenced this with her earlier research. Robert Whitman, Benjamin's youngest child, would have been 8 years old when the 1903 photograph was taken. By the 1930s, he would have been in his 40s, old enough to have known about David's existence and to have made his own choices about maintaining family connections. "We need to find out if Robert left any papers," Rebecca said. "He might have written about David, might have maintained some kind of relationship that wasn't documented in official records." The search for Robert Whitman's papers led them to his granddaughter, Patricia Whitmanshire, who lived in Knoxville. Rebecca contacted her through the Historical Society, explaining their research about the 1903 photograph and their interest in the Whitman family history. Patricia responded enthusiastically to the inquiry. She was 63 years old, a retired librarian with a strong interest in family history. She had boxes of papers and photographs inherited from her grandfather, including personal correspondence that she had been meaning to organize and donate to an appropriate archive. Rebecca and Daniel drove to Knoxville on a rainy November afternoon, meeting Patricia at her comfortable home in a tree-lined neighborhood. She greeted them warmly, leading them to her dining room where she had already spread out several boxes of materials. "I'm fascinated by what you've told me about the photograph," Patricia said, pouring coffee for them. I knew my grandfather had half-siblings from his father's generation, but I never heard anything about anyone being hidden or removed from the family. That's quite a revelation. She showed them the materials she had preserved. Robert Whitman's personal papers included diaries from the 1920s through the 1950s, family photographs, business correspondence, and most significantly, a collection of letters exchanged between Robert and David Fletcher spanning more than 3 decades. Rebecca carefully examined the letters, her heart racing as she realized what they had found. This was the connection they had been searching for, the evidence that David had not been completely isolated, that at least one member of his biological family had maintained a relationship with him throughout his life. The earliest letter was from Robert to David, dated January 1921, when Robert would have been 26 and David about 27. It was formal but warm, establishing contact and proposing occasional visits. Subsequent letters showed the development of a genuine relationship, Robert visiting David several times a year, the two men sharing news and maintaining family connection despite the social constraints that prevented public acknowledgement. In a 1928 letter, Robert wrote directly about their relationship. "I was young when father made the decision to place you with the Fletchers, too young to understand the complexity of the situation. But as I've grown older, I've come to see the injustice of it, how circumstances of birth determined everything about how you were treated. You are my brother, David, regardless of what public records say or what social conventions demand. I will not pretend otherwise, at least not between us." Patricia watched Rebecca read the letters, her own eyes moist. "I never knew," she said quietly. "My grandfather never spoke about David to me, though now I remember him making trips to Laurel Fork when I was a child. He would say he was visiting an old friend. I suppose that was true in a way." Armed with the letters between Robert and David, Rebecca and Daniel returned to their archives to complete David's story. The correspondence provided details that had been missing from official records, painting a fuller picture of David's life and his relationship with the family that had both claimed and disclaimed him. David had never married, a fact confirmed by the letters and by Robert's occasional worried mentions of David's isolation. The young woman Agnes Miller had remembered, the one who had lived with David briefly in the mid-1920s, was mentioned in a 1926 letter from David to Robert. "Anna has decided to return to her family in Virginia," David wrote. "She wanted more than I could offer her, wanted acknowledgement and social standing that I cannot provide given my circumstances. I understand her decision, though it leaves me quite alone." The Depression years had been difficult for David. His mechanical repair business sustained him but didn't provide prosperity. Robert had offered financial assistance several times, always couched in terms of loans or business investments to preserve David's pride. David had accepted occasionally but always repaid the money, maintaining his independence even in hardship. A 1935 letter from David to Robert revealed significant resentment despite the maintained relationship. "I appreciate your continued friendship, brother, and I don't wish to sound ungrateful. But sometimes I wonder what my life might have been if I had been acknowledged from the beginning, if I had been given the Whitman name and the opportunities it would have provided. I have built a decent life through my own efforts, and I take pride in that. But I am 41 years old, alone, with failing health from my railroad injury and no family of my own. Our father chose reputation over my well-being, and while I understand his reasoning, I cannot entirely forgive it." Robert's response showed genuine understanding and shared regret. "You are right to feel as you do, and I do not ask you to forgive what was done to you. I can only offer my own commitment to maintaining our connection, inadequate though that may be. You are my brother, and I will not abandon you, even if I cannot undo the past." The correspondence continued through World War II, when Robert's son served in the military and David contributed to the war effort by repairing equipment for the local civil defense organization. David's health declined through the late 1940s, the lingering effects of his railroad injury compounding with age and the physical demands of his work. In 1951, Robert wrote to David proposing that he move to a property Robert owned near Laurel Creek, where he could have better medical care and closer proximity to family. David's response was grateful but firm in declining. "I have built my life here in Laurel Fork, such as it is. The Fletcher farm is my home, the only place I have ever felt I truly belonged. I will remain here as long as I am able. But I am grateful for the offer, brother, and for your faithful friendship across all these years. David Fletcher died in March 1953 at the age of 59. Robert documented his death in his diary. David passed yesterday at the county hospital. I was with him at the end, holding his hand, calling him brother aloud for perhaps the first time in public. He smiled at that, said it was good to hear it before he died. I arranged for his burial in the Fletcher family plot, as that was his wish. I placed a proper stone marking him as David Fletcher, beloved brother. Those who know can understand. I have failed him in so many ways across his life, but I will not fail him in death. His existence mattered. He was family, and he deserves to be remembered. Rebecca felt tears on her cheeks as she read Robert's diary entry. She looked up at Patricia, who was crying openly, having read the same passage. "He's buried in Laurel Fork?" Patricia asked. "I never knew he existed, but he's my grandfather's brother, which makes him my great-uncle. Can we visit the grave?" 2 days later, Rebecca, Daniel, and Patricia drove together to Laurel Fork, following directions to the small Fletcher family cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley. It was a cold December morning, frost coating the bare tree branches, the mountains visible in the distance through the clear winter air. The cemetery was small and well-maintained, surrounded by a low stone wall. The Fletcher plot was toward the back, beneath an ancient oak tree. There were 3 headstones, Reverend Thomas Fletcher and his wife Mary, their dates spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and between them a 3rd stone. David Fletcher. Patricia read aloud from the inscription. Born 1894, died 1953. Beloved brother. Son of the mountains. The simplicity of the inscription was dignified, acknowledging David's connection without specifying the details. Beloved brother could mean Robert's brother, or it could be understood as a spiritual brotherhood, the way church communities often referred to members. But for those who knew the full story, the meaning was clear. Patricia knelt by the grave, placing flowers she had brought. "I'm sorry we didn't know about you," she said quietly. "I'm sorry you were hidden away, that you couldn't be acknowledged openly. But I know about you now, and I'll make sure others know too. You were family, you mattered, and you won't be forgotten." Rebecca photographed the grave, documenting David's final resting place. She thought about the 1903 photograph, about the reflected face in the mirror, about Benjamin Whitman's deliberate choice to include David in the family portrait even while social constraints required his physical absence. That photograph had been a message, perhaps not meant for immediate decoding but preserved as evidence of love and connection that transcended official acknowledgement. On the drive back to Johnson City, they talked about what to do with the research, how to present David's story responsibly and meaningfully. Patricia was adamant that David should be acknowledged as part of the Whitman family history, that his existence and his story should be preserved alongside those of his half-siblings. "I'll donate my grandfather's papers to your archives," Patricia said. "All of them, including the letters between him and David. These need to be preserved, need to be available for researchers and family members who want to understand the full picture of who we are and where we came from." Rebecca agreed to process the donation and to create an exhibition centered on the 1903 photograph and the story it had revealed. She would tell David's story with respect and nuance, acknowledging both the love that had existed within the Whitman family and the social constraints that had required his separation from them. Back at the archives, Rebecca and Daniel began preparing the exhibition materials. They would display the original 1903 photograph alongside dramatically enlarged versions showing the reflected face clearly. They would include relevant excerpts from Benjamin's diary, Catherine's letters, Robert's correspondence with David, and contemporary documents that explained the social context of illegitimacy in early 20th century Appalachia. Dr. Michael Torres, director of the Historical Society, was enthusiastic about the exhibition. "This is exactly the kind of complex social history that needs to be told," he said when Rebecca presented her proposal. "It's not just about one family's private circumstances. It's about how social conventions and expectations shaped people's lives, about how stigma and illegitimacy affected real human beings, about how families navigated impossible situations as best they could." And it's about how we can use careful historical research to recover stories that were deliberately hidden. Rebecca titled the exhibition, Reflections: The Hidden History of the 1903 Whitman Family Photograph. She wrote extensive explanatory panels that told David's story without sensationalizing it, that acknowledged the complexity of Benjamin and Catherine's choices without excusing the pain those choices caused David. One panel explored the technical aspects of how the reflected face had been captured, explaining the physics of light and mirrors, the long exposure times required by early 20th century photography, the lucky accident that had preserved David's image in the family portrait. Another panel discussed the social history of illegitimacy and family secrets in Appalachian communities, providing context for understanding the Whitman family's situation. But the heart of the exhibition was David's own story, told through documents and photographs that traced his life from childhood separation through his career, his injury, his later years, and his death. Rebecca wanted visitors to see David as a complete person, not just as a hidden face in a photograph or a tragic figure in a historical narrative. She included the photograph of David with the steam drill from his railroad days, showing him confident and capable. She displayed letters that revealed his intelligence and his complicated feelings about his situation. She showed the gravestone photograph with its dignified inscription acknowledging him as beloved brother. The exhibition opened on a cold January evening, 60 years almost to the day after David's death. Patricia attended with several other members of the extended Whitman family, descendants of Thomas, Elizabeth, James, Sarah, and Robert. Rebecca had been nervous about how they would react to having this family secret publicly revealed, but their response was overwhelmingly positive. "We had no idea," said Margaret Whitman Douglas, a great-granddaughter of Thomas, the eldest Whitman child. "But knowing about David, understanding this part of our family history, it makes us more complete. Every family has complications and secrets. Being willing to acknowledge them, to tell the full truth about where we come from, that's how we move forward." The local media covered the exhibition extensively, intrigued by the story of the hidden face revealed through digital enhancement. But what resonated most with visitors was the human dimension of the story, the way it illustrated how social stigma could separate families, how love could persist despite institutional barriers, how individuals could build lives and maintain dignity even in difficult circumstances. A genealogy blogger picked up the story and wrote a detailed post about the research process, which went viral among family history enthusiasts. Rebecca received dozens of emails from people who had discovered similar hidden relatives in their own family histories, children whose existence had been concealed or minimized, relationships that had been maintained privately while being publicly denied. "Your research gave me courage to investigate my own family's whispered stories," one woman wrote. "I've now connected with descendants of my grandmother's half-brother, a man who was placed for adoption and whose existence was never acknowledged by our family. We've welcomed them back into the family tree, recognized them as part of our history. Thank you for showing that these hidden stories matter and deserve to be told." 3 months after the exhibition opened, Patricia contacted Rebecca with unexpected news. While going through additional papers from her grandfather's estate, she had found a sealed envelope labeled, "To be opened after my death." Inside was a letter from Robert Whitman, written in 1958, 5 years after David's death and 2 years before Robert's own death. "If you are reading this," Robert had written, "then I am gone and can no longer be hurt by social judgment or embarrassed by revelation. I want it known that David Fletcher was my brother, the illegitimate son of my father Benjamin Whitman. I have kept this truth quiet during my life to protect David's privacy and to honor commitments made by my father. But David is dead now, and I believe his story deserves to be told fully and honestly. He was a good man who lived with dignity despite circumstances that would have destroyed lesser people. He was family, and he should be remembered as such." The letter went on to detail everything Robert knew about David's parentage and his life, providing information that filled remaining gaps in the documentary record. Most significantly, Robert revealed that David's biological mother had been a young woman named Sarah Morrison who had worked briefly in the Whitman household in 1893. She had died shortly after David's birth, and her own family had refused to take responsibility for the child. Benjamin had acknowledged his responsibility and arranged for David to be raised initially in his own household, though social pressure had eventually forced the arrangement with the Fletchers. "My father loved David," Robert wrote. "He visited him regularly, provided financial support, arranged for his education and care. But he could not publicly acknowledge him without destroying his business reputation and jeopardizing the future of his legitimate children. It was an impossible situation with no good solution. David paid the price for circumstances beyond his control, and while he built a respectable life through his own efforts, he deserved better. If this letter ever comes to light, I want it known that David Fletcher was a Whitman, that he was loved, that he mattered. His shadow was present in our family photograph, reflected in a mirror, seen only by those who looked carefully. But he was there. He was always there." Rebecca added Robert's letter to the exhibition, recognizing it as the final piece of David's story, the posthumous public acknowledgement he had never received during his life. She updated the exhibition materials to include the new information, enriching the narrative with details only Robert could have provided. The enhanced exhibition drew even more visitors, many of them returning to see the new materials and to understand David's story more completely. Patricia arranged for a commemorative plaque to be placed at the Fletcher Cemetery, officially acknowledging David's connection to the Whitman family and recognizing him as a member of the family tree. The story of David Fletcher and the 1903 photograph continued to resonate far beyond the initial exhibition. Rebecca was invited to present her research at historical conferences, to write articles for academic journals, to speak to genealogy societies about the techniques used to uncover hidden family histories. The photograph became a teaching example in archival science courses, illustrating how careful attention to detail could reveal information that wasn't immediately apparent. But the most meaningful responses came from individuals who connected personally with David's story. A support group for adoptees and people separated from their biological families contacted Rebecca, asking if they could use the photograph and story in their outreach materials. A documentary filmmaker proposed a project exploring the historical treatment of illegitimacy in American society, with David's story as a central case study. Patricia worked with other Whitman family members to create a more comprehensive family history that fully incorporated David into the family tree. They updated genealogical records, shared the story with distant relatives, ensured that future generations would know about David and understand his place in their heritage. "It changes how we think about family," Patricia explained during a panel discussion organized by the Historical Society. "We tend to think of family trees as straightforward, as clear lines of descent from one generation to another. But real families are complicated. There are hidden branches, secret connections, people who were excluded or concealed for various reasons. Acknowledging that complexity, being willing to investigate and reveal it, that makes our understanding of family and history more honest and complete." Rebecca received a particularly moving letter from a man in North Carolina who identified himself as a descendant of Sarah Morrison, David's biological mother. The Morrison family had maintained oral histories suggesting that Sarah had given birth to a child before her death, but they had never been able to confirm the details or learn what happened to the baby. "Reading about David, seeing that photograph, it answered questions my family has had for generations," the man wrote. "We always wondered what happened to Sarah's child, whether he survived, whether he had a good life. Now we know. He lived, he worked, he was loved by at least some members of his father's family. It's not a happy story, but it's a complete story, and that matters. We're grateful to you for uncovering it and telling it respectfully." The man included a photograph of Sarah Morrison, the only known image of David's biological mother. She had been young when the photograph was taken, probably in her late teens, with dark hair and delicate features that Rebecca immediately recognized as similar to the reflected face in the 1903 photograph. David had inherited his mother's looks, the genetic connection visible across generations. Rebecca added Sarah's photograph to the exhibition, creating a fuller picture of David's origins. She wrote a new panel exploring Sarah's brief life and the circumstances that had led to her death and David's displacement. It was another layer of tragedy, another young person whose life had been constrained and ultimately ended by the social and economic realities of late 19th century rural America. As the first anniversary of the exhibition approached, Rebecca reflected on how the project had changed her own approach to historical research. She had always been methodical and careful, but the David Fletcher investigation had taught her to pay even closer attention to anomalies, to trust her instincts when something seemed inconsistent or unusual, to be willing to invest time and effort in pursuing questions that might not have obvious answers. Every historical document contains more information than we initially see, she told a group of graduate students who came to learn about her research methods. Photographs especially are rich with detail that isn't immediately apparent. Reflections in mirrors or windows, shadows and light patterns, background elements that weren't the photographer's focus but that were captured anyway. All of these can provide crucial information if we're willing to look carefully and think critically about what we're seeing. She showed them the process she had used to enhance the reflected face in the 1903 photograph, demonstrated the comparative analysis that had helped identify David, explained how she had cross-referenced multiple types of historical records to piece together his life story. The students were fascinated, several of them already thinking about how they might apply similar techniques to their own research projects. Daniel had moved on to a position at a larger archive in Nashville, but he and Rebecca stayed in touch, collaborating occasionally on projects that required their complementary skills. He wrote to her after seeing a news article about the exhibition's anniversary, "I'm glad we didn't dismiss that reflected face as just a photographic anomaly or a simple mistake. Imagine if we had shrugged it off, never investigated further. David's story would have remained hidden, his existence unacknowledged." Sometimes the most important historical work happens when we refuse to accept simple explanations, when we're willing to dig deeper even when it would be easier not to. Patricia organized a family reunion that brought together descendants of all 6 of Benjamin Whitman's children, including the Morrison family descendants of David's mother. They gathered at the Historical Society for a private viewing of the exhibition before the public anniversary celebration. Standing in front of the enlarged 1903 photograph, 3 generations of Whitman and Morrison descendants looked at the image that had started everything. The 7 people posed on the porch, and the 8th person, David, visible only in reflection, hidden but present, excluded but loved, forever captured in that moment of October 1903. "He's part of us," said a young woman who was a great-great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Whitman. "We didn't know it until recently, but he's part of our family history, part of what makes us who we are. The circumstances of his life were unfair and sad, but he lived, he mattered, and now we know him. That feels important." The anniversary celebration drew a larger crowd than the original opening. Rebecca had curated additional materials for the occasion, including newly discovered photographs of David's mechanical repair shop, testimonials from Laurel Fork residents who had known him, and contemporary newspaper articles about the railroad accident that had changed his life. She gave a presentation summarizing the 2 years of research that had gone into uncovering David's full story, acknowledging the collaboration and contributions of many people who had helped piece together the narrative. She talked about the broader implications of the research, how it illustrated the need for historians to look beyond official records, to question assumptions, to be willing to investigate anomalies and inconsistencies. "History is full of hidden stories," Rebecca said in her conclusion. "People who were deliberately excluded from records, relationships that were concealed, lives that were lived in the shadows of social respectability. Our job as historians is not just to preserve what was officially documented but to uncover what was hidden, to give voice to those who were silenced, to acknowledge complexity even when it makes our narratives messier and less comfortable. David Fletcher deserves to be remembered not as a shameful secret but as a human being who lived with dignity despite difficult circumstances, who was loved by his family even when they couldn't publicly acknowledge him, who matters to history and to the descendants who now know his story." The applause was sustained and emotional. Patricia and several other family members were crying. Even Rebecca, who had maintained professional composure throughout the research and presentation process, felt tears on her cheeks. After the formal program ended, visitors moved through the exhibition, examining the photographs and documents, reading the carefully curated explanations. Rebecca overheard conversations about family secrets, about the courage required to investigate uncomfortable truths, about the importance of acknowledging all branches of family trees rather than pretending inconvenient relatives never existed. An elderly man approached Rebecca, introducing himself as Harold Fisher from a small community near Laurel Fork. "I knew David," he said quietly. "I was just a boy, but my father would take farm equipment to him for repairs. David was kind to me, showed me how mechanical things worked, never talked down to a child. I didn't know any of this history, didn't know about his connection to the Whitman family. But I'm glad his story is being told. He was a good man who deserved better than he got." Rebecca thanked him for sharing his memory, recognizing that these personal recollections added texture and dimension to the documentary record. David hadn't just been a name in archives and a reflected face in a photograph. He had been a real person who had interacted with his community, who had been kind to children, who had lived a life that touched others even in quiet ways. As the crowd thinned and the evening drew to a close, Rebecca stood alone in front of the 1903 photograph one more time. She had looked at this image hundreds of times over the past 2 years, had examined every detail, had enlarged and enhanced and analyzed until she could see it in her sleep. But it still moved her, still seemed to contain layers of meaning that weren't fully exhausted. 7 people posed on a porch in October 1903, formally arranged for a family portrait that would mark their place in time and society. And one person, visible only in reflection, hidden in shadow but undeniably present, included in the image through deliberate choice or lucky accident. All 8 of them were gone now, their lives complete, their stories finished. But through this photograph and the research it had inspired, they were all remembered, all acknowledged, all given their rightful place in history. Benjamin Whitman had made a choice when he commissioned that photograph, had decided to include David even while keeping him hidden. Perhaps he had hoped that someday, someone would notice the reflection, would investigate, would uncover the story and give David the public acknowledgement that Benjamin himself could not provide. Or perhaps the reflection was genuinely accidental, an unintended consequence of the photographer's positioning and the open door. Either way, the result was the same. David Fletcher had been preserved in that image, waiting more than a century for digital enhancement technology and careful historical research to reveal his presence. His shadow had been captured along with the others, his existence documented even when it couldn't be publicly proclaimed. And now, finally, his story was known. He was family. He mattered. He would be remembered. Rebecca locked the gallery and walked out into the cool spring evening, the mountains visible in the distance, the same mountains that had surrounded David throughout his life in Laurel Fork. She thought about the long chain of choices and circumstances that had led to this moment, about how a single photograph could contain so much hidden information, about how the past was never really finished but always available for rediscovery and reinterpretation. Somewhere in those mountains was David's grave, marked with its simple stone acknowledging him as beloved brother. Somewhere in archives and family Bibles and old photographs were thousands of other stories waiting to be uncovered, other hidden faces waiting to be recognized, other lives waiting to be acknowledged and remembered. Rebecca smiled, thinking about future projects, about photographs not yet examined, about mysteries not yet solved. The work of recovery and remembrance was never complete. There would always be more stories to uncover, more reflections to notice, more lives to bring back into the light where they belonged. And she would keep looking, keep investigating, keep paying attention to the details that others might miss. Because history mattered. People mattered. Even those who had been hidden, especially those who had been hidden, deserved to be remembered and honored. That was the lesson of David Fletcher and the 1903 photograph. That was the work that needed doing. And Rebecca was grateful to do it.